This lecture is a discussion about the November-December Public Forum Resolution, the benefits of the United States federal government's use of offensive cyber operations outweighs the harms. I'll begin the lecture with some discussion of some of the critical terms and ideas behind the resolution, and then move into the major pro and con arguments. The most important thing to discuss, I think, is what is an offensive cyber operation? And what does it mean to use offensive cyber operations? So offensive cyber operations are generally operations that involve kind of an intrusion, an unauthorized intrusion, I should say, into the network of another entity. In this case, we're usually talking about another nation or another non-state actor, such as a terrorist group. You could debate and consider whether or not that also means maybe kind of infiltrating other like criminal networks. Obviously, the line between a criminal and a terrorist, right, is not clear. But generally, when the literature that's talking about offensive cyber operations is talking about using these operations against another country or against a terrorist organization. But as this evidence indicate, it is a deliberate intrusion into an opponent's network or systems with the intention of causing damage or destruction. There's another definition that says it's computer activities that are designed to disrupt, degrade, or destroy. I found a course description where it talks about the offensive track of a cybersecurity course, and the offensive track being about using ethical hacking. So we're talking about hacking, intruding, right, without permission, without authorization, into another network. Ordinarily what's being discussed in the literature as another country's network or a terrorist organization's network. Now, one thing the resolution does say is like using these offensive cyber operations. The word use in the resolution does clarify that the cyber operations are being, these offensive cyber operations are being used. But in reality, whenever you're conducting an offensive cyber operation, you are using the operation. So that's why I'm saying it's a little bit redundant. It does say you're using it, right? Like when you are hacking, right? So when you're not hacking, you're not hacking. You're not engaging in an offensive cyber operation. When you're just developing a virus, but you're not putting that virus like in another entity's computer network, that you're not engaging in an offensive cyber operation, right? It's only once you take that virus and you put it in another country or entity's computer network, then you're engaging in an offensive cyber operation. So all the literature that's talking about offensive cyber operations is talking about using them. But the word use will make it very clear to a judge, right, that these are being used. And I think some negatives, con teams may try to misrepresent the literature and saying, well, we're saying the U.S. can have these offensive cyber operations, just like we have nuclear weapons. We're just saying we shouldn't use them. But what I'm saying is it's important to understand is when there is an offensive cyber operation, it is being used, right? Like whenever you're conducting a military operation, you are using the military. But that generally sets the stage for what an offensive cyber operation is. It's hacking. It's a deliberate intrusion. We can carry these out in different ways. Sometimes what the U.S. will do is hack into another country's computer system and like leave a virus on the system. We won't kind of activate the virus or try to activate the virus maybe until there's some conflict that erupts with the country, such as a war or war attacked in some particular way. We may kind of quote unquote like detonate the virus or like release the virus. But just kind of moving in and putting that cyber bomb in, that in and of itself is a use that in and of itself is a use of an offensive cyber operation, even if we don't technically detonate the bomb until there's a conflict. We might jam their servers. We might create a denial of service attack. We might just kind of simply retaliate in a conflict. We could use counter-influence. Counter-influence is the idea that, hey, if the Russians get on Facebook and they're trying to manipulate the results of our election, we could also get on Facebook and try to manipulate the results of their election by trying to get people to vote in some particular ways, right? So we're infiltrating those networks as we do with any kind of cyber operation, offensive cyber operation, and try to get a result. It might be espionage. We might be stealing secrets, or they might be stealing our secrets. We might be stealing their military secrets. We might be stealing their economic secrets. We might just be conducting surveillance, general surveillance. In other words, what we might be doing is kind of looking into these networks and trying to kind of figure out like, hey, what are they doing? What are their military troop movements, right? If we think the Russians are about to invade the Ukraine, we would want to know about that. We might just be surveilling terrorists. We might be kind of engaging in things to disrupt the communication of terrorists or to disrupt the communications of kind of the Russian military forces. So there's a lot of things we're doing to get into these networks, right? So once we get into the networks, or getting in there kind of through hacking, because the Russians are obviously not like letting us into their network. Once we hack, we are engaged in an offensive cyber operation. So really anything probably from at the minimum, that hacking on is going to constitute an offensive cyber operation. Then we may be getting in there, we maybe just be learning about their networks. So in the event that a war breaks out, we can engage in some cyber warfare. We may be planning these cyber viruses. We may be just be engaging in surveillance. We may be engaging in a counter-influence campaign because we want a candidate in another country to win a particular election, right? Those are all additional offensive cyber operations in and of themselves and can constitute cyber operations. But that kind of gives you a sense of kind of what they are. And it is important to understand the details, or at least detailed examples of what offensive cyber operations are or can be. So when you're talking about like why they need to be offensive instead of just defensive, you can use those examples, right? And then it's kind of just another definition I found after the fact, right? Use of cyber capabilities for national security purposes. And of course, we are talking about the United States offensive cyber operations, right? Are they net desirable? Now, a few notes about the resolution, right? The resolution does imply a change from the status quo, from the current world, but it doesn't require a change from the world, right? There's no proposed policy change. So we do, as I will discuss in a minute, the United States federal government does use offensive cyber operations now, right? So it would seem to suggest if you're saying they're bad, we should get rid of them, though you're not necessarily on the con. In the con, you're not really advocating for a policy option. You're just kind of saying, like, we shouldn't, maybe you're suggesting we shouldn't do these. They're on balance undesirable, but it doesn't require you to advocate a policy that could produce other disadvantages. Obviously, it would matter, like, in a state of war, right? Like, you can say on balance cyber, offensive cyber operations are, like, desirable. But if we're not in a state of war, then, if we are in a state of war, I guess I'll say it that way, it's kind of hard to argue against them, right? Because why would we, for example, want to be bombing a country without first disabling, like, their electric grid that allows them to maybe shoot missiles at us, or it allows us to see them in the dark, right? So it's kind of hard to argue against an offensive, or harder to argue against an offensive cyber operation. We are at war with another country than when we are not. And also, of course, it's hard to say never, what does the question mean? Like, are we saying it generally does not? Right? Obviously, the resolution can't be determined by specific examples, but those are all things to consider. I haven't really formalized any like strong opinions on exactly kind of how the resolution should be interpreted and in what particular side's obligations or burdens are, but it is something to think about. You're just kind of generally saying whether these are desirable or not, and you're not having a discussion advocating a policy change. It is important to understand that in the status quo, we do use offensive cyber operations, and we use them much more regularly than we ever have in the past. So under the Obama administration, offensive cyber operations were used, but that not very regularly. They had to be signed off by the president. In this case, in the current world under the Trump administration, they're used quite regularly, and the president doesn't have to sign off on them. Now, some people might say, don't like Trump. You say, oh, well, that's because Trump, he's like this warmonger, he just supports war. But, the reality of it is that even if Obama had stayed president, there's a good chance we might have developed the same kind of policies, because all countries in the world right now, or at least most countries, are engaging in offensive cyber warfare on a pretty regular basis, and so are terrorist groups. So it would be hard to kind of continue this policy of essentially trying to avoid using it, requiring presidential sign-off in every instance. But that is just something to be aware of, because I think part of the debate, you can make arguments about, offensive cyber operations. The current process, like you might say, well, even if, even if they're generally not that bad, the process the United States uses to authorize them is bad because it results in like too many offensive cyber operations and too many other problems. Kind of just quickly before we get into the pros and cons, I just want to review a few other terms of the resolution. There's blue zone cyber operations, which are just kind of regular operations that we kind of engage kind of peacefully and kind of with our allies. There's things in the red zone, which are kind of like warfare, like we are trying to sink like overt warfare, red zone cyber operations. And there's the gray zone. The gray zone is a new military term that essentially refers to kind of this area between peace and conflict. So say, for example, we the Russians, or the Chinese, a good example of this, they're building like artificial islands in the South China Sea, right? And they're supporting more of their military forces there. That's not like they're not engaging in direct battle, but they're really being like substantially militarily aggressive. If the Russians engage in like a cyber operation, a minor one, like they just take out like, they just kind of realize and they're testing it out, and we'll talk about the importance of testing, they realize they can take down one small part of a country's grid. That's not like necessarily like a military, I mean, it's a military action, but it's not something that's like a direct act of war, right? They're not bombing Pearl Harbor, right? So there are all these operations, military operations now, that happen around the world in what's called the gray zone, and they are operations other than war. Weapons of mass destruction is just a term I want to clarify because a lot of people ask me about it. Weapons of mass destruction are generally considered nuclear weapons, biological weapons, and chemical weapons. They kind of have a capacity to kind of kill like large numbers of people all at once. Now, there are other terms that are used kind of informally or like colloquially. Somebody may say, oh, a cyber weapon, that's a weapon of mass destruction because it could kill like a lot of people. But kind of in a more technical sense, weapons of mass destruction are nuclear weapons, biological weapons, and chemical weapons. Okay, so what are some of the major pro-arguments? Why do we use this? I think one strong argument the pro teams really want to make, because it kind of gets around this debate about kind of do they deter or not deter, is like, look, if we didn't have use offensive cyber operations in many instances, the alternative might be warfare or at least military activity that's more likely to escalate. So, for example, recently, you can read about this, the U.S. or Iran shot down a $100 million drone at the U.S. There was the U.S. drone, like, over the Gulf, right? So they shot down this $100 million drone. There was a lot of temptation to launch some cruise missiles at them or bombs. But Trump decided, well, that wouldn't really be proportional. That would kill, like, too many people. The Iranians didn't kill anybody. So instead, we launched a cyber attack, and I think it was on some of their energy facilities. You could check that out, right? Disabled some of these facilities, some of their military facilities, right? It was, and maybe just a few people died or maybe even nobody died. But we obviously couldn't do like nothing, right? We couldn't just decide not to engage in any cyber war and any retaliation. So we retaliated with the cyber. We retaliated in their attack with cyber, which had we bombed them, at least would have killed a lot of people, and it could have maybe escalated, right, to a larger war. So there is some pretty good evidence, and there's some good evidence in the file that this is just kind of like a strong alternative to war. Now, there's a whole debate about why we need offensive cyber operations for the purposes of deterrence or checking aggression of other countries. And what you want to be thinking about in terms of processing these arguments is, why does that deterrence have to be offensive? So think about it this way. We have nuclear weapons. If somebody attacks us, we can retaliate with those nuclear weapons. It's kind of like a defensive deterrence, right? That's what we're usually talking about. But here, we're saying we should engage in offensive cyber operations, okay, for the purposes of deterrence, which if you don't know a lot about cyber conflict, or you might be a judge who knows little or nothing about cyber conflict, or even a coach who didn't really, I've been in debate for a long time. These arguments have come up. I've read about this generally. But I really wouldn't have been able to answer the question a month ago, why do you need offensive cyber operations to deter? Well, there are a number of reasons, all right? And this is why it's part of the U.S. policy under a new general, all right, Nakyon, about why we should, quote-unquote, defend forward. What does that mean? Well, go back to my original discussion of what is an offensive cyber operation. It probably starts with, or at least one of the initial stages, is hacking into another country's network. Okay? Once you engage in that hacking and you get in that network, you are engaging in offensive cyber warfare. Okay? Well, why do you need to engage in that offensive cyber warfare to deter? Why can't you just wait, right? And if they attack you, respond. Well, there's a lot of basic reasons, and kind of one of the kind of cornerstone reasons is that these cyber operations and cyber defenses, if you want to call them that, they're not going to work unless we're already in their network. Why? Well, think about it this way. This is really simple, right? If you need to hack into somebody's network, you don't know that you can succeed. You don't know that your virus is going to detonate until you already are inside their network and until you already know that essentially the virus is likely to work, right? We know if we launch nuclear weapons at Russia that most of them, or all of them, or most of them are at least likely to fly over the North Pole and land in Russia and detonate. We can do that by testing them at home, right? We know that we can shoot cruise missiles and have them land in Russia. right? We know all of these things are true, right, or are likely true, okay? But we don't know that we can actually hack into a network until we're in the network. So if we think a conflict is coming with Iran or Russia or China or potentially could do, we cannot wait until that conflict has started or even until it is imminent to try to hack into the network, okay? And then once we hack into the network, we can plant a cyber bomb. As I said earlier, we don't have to detonate, right, until the cyber bomb is kind of already there and like ready to, until we need it, till the conflict has started. There's absolutely no reason to detonate the bomb, but it has to be present. We need to know that we can be inside their systems so we can jam their electronic systems, so we can try to disable their anti-aircraft guns. We might want to be in there using surveillance and using viruses for surveillance of their military operations, right? We do try to surveil other countries from other ways, such as like from airplanes or satellites from space. But we can't be surveilling them as inside their computer networks until we are inside their networks, okay? We need to be hacked in order to get in there ahead of time. Other people say that we need our adversaries to have less money for their own offense, right? So if they have to invest money in defense because we're constantly trying to hack into their networks, then they're going to have less money that's available for offense. We might want to steal our adversaries' tools. We might want to steal some of their own computer viruses, right? We also want to demonstrate our capabilities until we actually hack into a network, right? And maybe kind of use like a little virus or take down like part of their network. They don't really know that we can succeed in doing that. We also want to practice, right? We've got to practice these cyber attacks. Like we got to know they're going to work. Like a lot of people say that the Russians, the reason they got involved in the war in Syria is they wanted to test out some new weapons. That's horrible, right? Because a lot of people died, right? But they wanted to like test those weapons in battle. Well, we can't test our cyber weapons in actual battle conditions until we kind of engage in a little bit of cyber operations. We may need to know that we can take control of a remote computer, right? We need to understand their networks. We do want to kind of relate it to practice, like use our networks continuously, all right? We want to be able to degrade our adversaries' networks and just kind of wear them down. Like one example that's given in the literature is like if you're boxing, right, and you're trying to defeat your opponent, you can't just win by playing defense. Like you can't just put your hands in front of your face, right? Originally you have to punch them, and once in a while you probably have to punch them in the head. And once you're punching them in the head, that makes it harder for them to punch you back, right? So the only way to kind of do this is to kind of degrade them down. Other kind of strong argument is that, look, adversaries don't necessarily think we'll respond with other weapons. Like Iran may think, okay, we'll shoot down one of their unmanned drones. They're not going to respond with like a nuke. Right? All debaters are like, oh, we'll never have a war because there's nuclear weapons. It's like, well, okay, but people think they can shoot down our drones and then we're not going to respond with a nuke and trigger a nuclear war. Right? Or we're not going to put American soldiers' lives on the line with like a conventional force retaliation. Right? So they're not as confident that we're going to retaliate in those ways, but if we demonstrate our abilities to retaliate with cyber weapons, they may be less deterred from launching an attack. Also, it's just kind of a force multiplier, stronger forces. There's some good evidence, right? Like, how does the U.S. try to defeat ISIS? Well, we engage in military attacks. We engage in diplomacy by trying to get them together. We engage in surveillance, but we also go in there, we try to disrupt their communications. We try to, right, demobilize their systems. Like, we try to do, like, all these different things, like, at one time. So, you know, just as, like, you know, somebody might have said, well, when airplanes first kind of started being used, like, we're inventing the universal system war, people say, well, why? Well, no, we already have an army. We already have a navy, right? Well, the Air Force kind of became a third component, right? A third kind of military strategy, right? And then, you know, so for the same reason, this is a whole other domain of warfare, but it also interacts with the other domains of warfare. It also kind of means that, like, countries, and you can look at specifics, there's really good evidence that says that Iran hasn't been able to kind of board so many tanker ships in the Gulf as they were doing before and try to threaten to disrupt activities there because we've disrupted the cyber attacks that we've engaged in had disrupted their ability to track the ships and to, like, you know, threaten to, like, launch some of their weapons, right? So, you know, just kind of generally, we need to be inside the adversary's networks in order to anticipate attacks, to surveil them, to kind of be prepared to have viruses in there to like jam up their computer systems, to kind of threaten their own maybe electoral or political processes if they threaten ours. All right. And that the only way you can do this is to kind of be actively kind of inside the network, right? So to kind of example of like, you know, U.S. democracy, election security, right? If you want to kind of run that scenario, people say, look, that we knew the Russians were kind of trying to manipulate our election, but some people say we couldn't do a lot about it because we knew they had a cyber bomb planted in our grid, and if we sanctioned them or were too overtly hostile about this, they could have threatened all or part of our electric grid, right? So in that case, because they were able to plant this bomb, right, it limited our ability to retaliate. So we want to kind of be able to do the same things. We want to get these bombs, cyber bombs, planted on the Russian networks. Also, like, we know there are all these like Russian trolls, right, who are engaged in kind of activity to like compromise the U.S. election, right? Even if it's not directly hacking into the systems and changing the outcome, they're trying to influence the election, you know, by making up stuff about candidates and like deploying it online. Okay, it's like, well, we need to be able to fight these Russian trolls off with like cyber weapons, right? We're not going to nuke them. We're not going to nuke the Russian trolls. We're probably not going to start a conventional, we're not going to invade Russia. We're not going to shoot cruise missiles at them because they have a troll farm where they're trying to like manipulate our election. But that's not credible. They're not really going to think we're actually going to do that. They really don't want to do that, right? Like a lot of people could die. But what we could do is kind of retaliate like against these. We could kind of, you know, do denial of service attacks. We could try to disrupt the Russian troll systems. We could engage in our old counter-influence campaign. A credible deterrent response. So all these reasons I've kind of talked about, right, as to like kind of how we need to be inside these systems, engaging in offensive warfare, then you can kind of put on some scenarios, like pro scenarios, right, like Iran. You could say, hey, we need to do these things that I just discussed to stop Iran from being aggressive, to stop China from being aggressive, to stop North Korea from being aggressive, to stop Russia from being aggressive, to go after terrorists or ISIS. And I put in a power slide, that might be something that's easier for middle school debaters, right? Like, hey, we need to go get these bad guys and we need to mess up with their computer networks. All right, that's something that's kind of very straightforward. And there's good evidence on that for the file, that we need to kind of take out other countries, you know, nuclear, like undermine their ability to develop nuclear weapons. Like there are two good examples of this, right? Like North Korea, like if you debated the THAAD topic, or you debated a couple of years ago, North Korea kept launching these ballistic missiles. And people saying they're developing intercontinental ballistic missiles, which could hit the United States. Some people said, look, this is a very big threat. Well, all of a sudden, the missiles started falling to the ground. A lot of people think the U.S. hacked into there and disabled the system. Similarly, with Iran, there's a good example of a Stuxnet virus. They won't say who, but it was either the U.S. or Israel spent years developing this virus that basically it disrupted all of Iran's kind of centrifuges and its critical nuclear facilities. Which kind of messed up its ability to develop nuclear weapons. You could say we might want to take out their power grid. The NATO argument's a little bit different. The NATO is the U.S. North Atlantic Treaty Organization. That is an organization of kind of Western European countries and the United States, a few others, that kind of is meant to kind of deter Russian aggression, kind of stabilize the area. Say, well, the NATO has actually shifted now to an offensive cyber operations posture. Even if you think back to that card at the beginning of the lecture where it kind of defined like what offensive cyber operations were, it said NATO wasn't currently using them. That was a 2015 card. They are currently using them. So if the U.S. were to kind of back out of its offensive cyber operations, that could disrupt NATO. Now, it does kind of beg the question, right? Because the U.S. is not engaging in these offensive cyber operations. Right? Like, or I should say we are engaging in the offensive cyber operations, but the con isn't advocating a policy change. So it's not clear if that links, right? But it's just kind of saying that you need NATO cohesion and unity behind these offensive cyber operations. Now, obviously a big argument the con's going to make is that these things could escalate, right? They're going to say, hey, if I attack your electric grid, then you could bomb me. So a critical thing, the pro's obviously going to have to answer all the con arguments, and the con's going to have to answer all the pro arguments, right? But one argument I do want to highlight, okay, is escalation, right? That the con's going to say this could escalate. You could say, well, one, it reduces the risk of counter-value escalation. The reason is that there is less collateral damage. So think about it. If I have to attack your power plant now, I'm going to drop some bombs in the area that blow up your power plant, kill a lot of people, and probably kill a whole lot of people in the area. That's going to create political pressure inside your country for this conflict to escalate. But if I don't do that, right, if I just kind of take out like part of that electrical grid, part of that power plant, nobody dies and there's no collateral damage in the area, which I can do with targeted use of cyber weapons, then it's probably not likely to escalate. You could say that countries will want to stay below the threshold of war. Remember I talked about that gray zone? Cyber operations live in that gray zone. Like, maybe that makes those kind of things too easy because there's less deterrent value, right? It makes it too easy for people to engage in, but, hey, maybe it keeps us away from warfare. And look, again, remember the argument we talked about earlier. If there's no cyber war, then when a country's attacked, they might engage in conventional war. But I kind of just highlight this particular argument and go through some answers and may talk about it more later, or I should say have more evidence on it more later. But you've got to answer when you're pro, you've got to be well prepared to answer the argument that that the use of offensive cyber operations escalates. And you want to be able to do that like kind of with some debate offense, right? Turns, right? You want to have reasons that offensive cyber operations actually de-escalate conflict. Okay? In response to con arguments, okay, you're going to need to answer, look, this is a crux argument, which is why I spent a lot of time with this at the beginning of the lecture. You're going to want to say, hey, defensive, let's just secure our networks. That's good enough. We don't need to be offensive. Right? You're going to say, the con's going to say we need arms control, maybe even need some disarmament, right, of cyber weapons. Like we should be heading away from cyber weapons, not towards offensive use. That we should just make our networks a little bit more resilient, which goes to the defensive deterrence argument. Some people make a big issue about norms. Norms are an international, right? There's laws and norms, right? So if you debated law of the sea, you may have learned about this. Laws can lead to norms, even if it doesn't explicitly say it. So you may say, hey, well, there's a norm against kind of military activity in the Arctic, even if there's no exact law against it. And if the U.S. breaches that norm, okay, then other countries will breach the norm. It'll escalate. Say, well, if the U.S. engages in offensive cyber warfare, then norms against offensive cyber warfare will decline. Probably not really the best argument because the norms are probably the other way, and it's probably not reversible at this point, but I'm just saying that's an example of an argument. Some people say that civilians do die in these attacks. Like, look, the attacks have been limited in the status quo. Maybe somebody shut down a part of a power grid, but if they did that for a very short period of time, right? They didn't do it for a long period of time. And if they did it for a long period of time, then people wouldn't be able to like clean water and like produce food, and there'd be all kinds of crime and robberies and social instability like in the dark, right? So this could get a lot worse. You could say that this will cause retaliatory attacks on our own power grid, which could be bad. Other people say, look, it's going to trigger war with Iran, war with Russia, war with China. These are all specific scenarios that you need to be prepared to answer, okay? In terms of answering con arguments, right, you have to answer the argument that the offense leads to retaliation, okay, as I kind of just discussed. Miscalculation is a big one, right? Like, countries might think they're under attack and that their nuclear infrastructure is at risk. So when teaching this topic, one of the things I always ask the students is like, well, hey, if you were in charge of all U.S. nuclear weapons and you thought Russia was about to be able to disable them through a cyber attack, what would you do? And there's two answers. Like, one, I don't know what to do. Or two, the correct answer, I would launch them all. Well, why would you launch them all? You would launch all the weapons because you think, if we don't use them now, the Russians are going to disable all our weapons and then they're going to nuke us, right? So we need to be able to launch immediately before they're disabled, right? So see how it creates instability? And it doesn't just have to be nuclear weapons. It could be other weapon systems that you are kind of very tempted to use, right? Or if you think they're going to be taken out. What if they take out all your tanks or all the ability of your soldiers to communicate, right? Or they're about to disable all of your satellites in space, right? You're going to have to say, well, I want to be militarily aggressive now before I lose all this capability, right? Cyber weapons can also be stolen. This is a good argument, even against deterrence. Once we penetrate these networks and use this weapon, then other countries can copy it quickly. And they can use it back against us. So those are the con arguments you need to answer, and we'll kind of hit them a little bit again, kind of as we go through the con. But you need to kind of go through and be prepared to answer these arguments. Now, in terms of a pro framework, there's a lot of different frameworks, and everybody kind of in public forum feels the need to say, like, hey, this is our framework, right? And then sometimes they feel the need to, they'll just say, like, hey, whoever saves the most lives wins. I mean, okay, that's barely even that you need to say, so they'll have a simple framework, or it won't become something, or they'll make a bigger deal out of it, come something. That's rare. But one thing you want to think about a framework is realism. Realism is based on the idea that countries are always going to act on their own self-interest, and they're not really going to follow norms and rules and arms control agreements. And if they do, they only do that at the time that it's in their self-interest, and then they back out. So kind of says, like, the underlying theory is that, like, explains, like, why we can never really have, like, effective arms control agreements, okay? So you might want to kind of defend a theory of realism and say, look, we need to develop these. Everybody else is going to develop them. There's nothing else we can really do about that, right? So we kind of need to do these. That's just a thought. You could think about other frameworks. Now, con arguments. What are the con arguments? Well, look, one problem with these is obviously we're in a constant state of warfare. As I said, this gray zone warfare just kind of goes on and, like, continues every day. The commanders don't need authority, all right, to kind of launch these weapons, which just makes them more likely to use them, and they're more likely to wars. There's evidence that says that U.S. commanders successfully attacked, like, part of the Russian electrical grid and disabled it without even permission from the president. So even in kind of what you would probably consider to be a major operation, they're not even getting sign-off from the president. Say, hey, this is, like, kind of likely to kind of lead to the U.S. initiating wars. Like I said, since we don't have to sign it off, that if we put implanted weapons in these other countries' grids, right, and they find that, then they may kind of preempt that with their own attacks on the United States, whether they're physical attacks, traditional warfare, or they're cyber attacks. There's kind of arguments about, like, well, look, countries are on hair trigger alert now, right? Because they're always fearful that their cyber systems, their computer systems can be disabled, and they need those computer systems to conduct wars. So they're more likely to kind of quickly, like, make quick decisions when they're any time of instability or, like, potential crisis, or they think somebody has a cyber upper hand, that they're likely to engage in activities to, like, wipe out these operations. Since we're on a hair trigger, there is going to be pressure to respond, right? If part of the electric grid is disabled, right? There's going to be popular pressure to respond. We might not even know where the attack is coming from, right? Maybe Iran thinks it can't win a war against the U.S., but maybe if they think that it'd be good if the U.S. got into a war with Russia. So they're gonna, or a terrorist group even more likely to do this, right? They're kind of engage in some hacking and produce a virus that makes it appear that the Russians have launched the cyber attack, when maybe the Russians didn't do it, right? So you could get a third party triggering escalation, triggering a major war between other parties. Obviously, this could lead to kind of these cyber conflicts with China, Iran, North Korea, just kind of different, just different countries, right? So the con can have scenarios against, like, different countries, right? To go back, so can the pro, so can the con. You could talk about, like, why the civilian targeting, maybe civilian infrastructure, is immoral, right? You could emphasize, right, nuclear, which could be one of your framework arguments. You could emphasize it could be a nuclear crisis, which again could be a framework argument. You could say, look, a nuclear crisis could end the world, right? So we can't have any nuclear crises. Even if cyber deterrence works in a lot of different instances, disrupts terrorist organizations, maybe stops Iran from being aggressive in the Strait of Hormuz, we shouldn't risk a nuclear war, a global nuclear war, use them or lose them, a hair trigger, a crisis instability thing that could escalate and kill everybody. Some people say this undermines our relations with our allies, because sometimes we have to kind of use, like the internet is global, right? So maybe you have to, like, hack into part of France's network to go after some activity in Iran, but maybe France doesn't really like that, right? So there's some evidence, and all of our allies don't support kind of offensive, like, as strong, or at least I should say as strong of offensive cyber operations as the U.S. does. So this could hurt relations with our allies. And this argument is kind of interesting because it's a bit distinct from your kind of regular, like, hey, this is, this is going to cause or deter a cyber conflict. It's like, well, hey, this is going to hurt our relations with our allies, regardless of kind of the merits of offensive cyber deterrence. It's going to hurt our relations with our allies, and we do need our allies' support to stop war. There's a different argument that viruses can escape and be used outside their intended purposes. So to go back to that Stuxnet example, okay, one problem with the Stuxnet virus is that some criminals were able to get a hold of the virus and use it to threaten like FedEx. They took down part of FedEx's network and some other companies, right? So, and again, that's a separate argument from whether it deters or like doesn't deter and causes crisis escalation. You can make an argument about kind of maybe like executive power. Like right now, the commanders just like have too much power. There's no review of authority. There's no civilian review of their authority to kind of carry out war. So you could say right now the executive branch has kind of delegated like too much of that responsibility. The executive branch has delegated too much of that responsibility away from the president, away from civilian authorities. And what that could do is actually threaten the kind of the ability to Congress to review warfare, right? And there's a big debate about like, hey, should Congress have a say in like what wars we're getting into? Obviously, under the Constitution, they have to a degree. It's always debated. But basically, this process kind of takes away from Congress, right, their ability to kind of be involved in decisions about warfare, especially when you have commanders kind of making those decisions on their own. Okay, now I want to talk a bit about deterrence, right? Because we know that is a core pro argument. And look, even if the pros making general scenarios about Iran, Russia, China, whatever, deterring their activity, their arguments are kind of similar, right? We need to hack into their networks. We need to plant the bombs. We need to engage in surveillance. We need to test their networks. We need to know what we can do, okay? So even if the scenario changes, the links for the most part are going to kind of be the same. So how do we kind of answer this general argument that without cyber warfare, the U.S. is going to be under attack, threatened with attacks, war could happen? Well, we want to say, look, there's other tools we can use. There's other military activities. We can have conventional weapons. We have nuclear weapons. We can also engage in diplomatic pressure and use like our alliances. That's one argument. The second thing you could say is like it's bad to rely on offensive cyber warfare because it's too easy for countries to counter it. It is really hard to like make a nuclear weapon with like an ICBM. To have that kind of nuclear infrastructure to do that, to copy what the U.S. does, it takes years, if not decades. All right, as we see so many countries, but it's not that hard to make a virus and to duplicate a virus. So a lot of people say like we shouldn't even like demonstrate our capability to do things, which is like one of the arguments for deterrence, because it's actually once we demonstrate that, it's very easy for other kind of countries to kind of, or terrorist groups to kind of emulate that and then have the virus themselves. As I discussed, it could cause an accidental or miscalculated conflict because we think we're under threat when we're not, or we think one country attacked us when it was a virus that was actually being sent by a terrorist group or another small country. It could cause escalation because the power grid gets shut down, then we want to retaliate. Some people say that, it becomes a blueprint for other attacks, right? That like we can say other countries will not just copy the virus, but the way that we did it. And then they'll be able to do it. You can say it's immoral to target civilian infrastructure. And look, the reality is deterrence can just break down. We can't necessarily rely on deterrence, right? Say, okay, two people hate each other, like they could threaten to kill each other. Well, they each have a gun. Okay, well, you can rely on that. They won't shoot each other, but eventually that could break down. Well, the same thing is true in warfare, except it has a much bigger impact. We could say that, look, offensive cyber operations don't really change behavior. Maybe that offensive cyber operation against Iran, maybe it delayed their nuclear program. Some people say by about as much as 2 years. But look, the reality is they can reconstitute that. They can figure it out. They do. They become more aggressive in the Gulf, perhaps because of the attack. Maybe North Korea is now developing biological weapons, all right, or it's figuring out some other way to launch its weapons. It does, obviously, kind of slows things down. I think that's almost a given, but like how much is really debated. A lot of people say it doesn't really make that much of a difference. Also, if we destroy other countries' computer networks, then we can't spy on them. Right? That's difficult. Countries know, again, our adversaries. Some people think we won't really engage. Same reason for nuclear weapons, that maybe we'll engage in a small cyber attack, but it won't really be very big because it might escalate. And then, it's targeting civilians is immoral. I had that before, but just this whole premise that we shouldn't engage in cyber operations to do that. Then, of course, you're going to want to, answer arguments that like, hey, this could cause a conflict. We need this to deter the Russians, the Chinese, the Iranians, right? We need it to protect NATO. we needed to protect the U.S. democratic system, that we need to stop cyber terrorism and terrorism, to stop nuclear proliferation, to stop attacks on the U.S. power grid or other U.S. industries. And look, I kind of blew through those arguments kind of quickly, but I talked about all of them earlier in the lecture, right? When I said we really need to be, these are different reasons that you arguably need cyber deterrence. So look, I'm just saying on the con, you're going to have to go through and answer these. You can't have your general arguments about why cyber deterrence fails, but you're also going to need to go through and respond to these. Now, in terms of con strategy, right? I think one thing you want to think about on the con is like your con case, you want to have a contention about why offensive cyber deterrence is bad, right? That it undermines crisis stability, that it risks conflict, that people steal the viruses, that once we destroy their networks, they can't get into the systems, that they copy our viruses and use them against us. All these arguments, I know I just said them quickly, but all these arguments that I talked about before, you want to say this, when you're con, you want to say this undermines cyber deterrence. Then I would have a specific scenario about why it does, maybe in the case of Iran, etc. Okay, and then maybe have something that is kind of independent of kind of whether or not cyber deterrence works. Maybe potentially a third contention, right? The kind of like executive power, right? Or the viruses are going to escape and like be used somewhere else. It doesn't have anything to do with deterrence, right? So I'm saying on the con, you want to kind of generally have offensive cyber deterrence increases the war risks and undermines kind of general deterrence. B, a specific scenario, and then C, potentially contention that's just kind of completely independent of that. Then you want to kind of, on the con framework, right, you want to kind of talk about maybe generally why offensive war postures are bad, why it's bad to kind of worry about security, war risks increase with offensive postures, maybe even some kind of general theory about like international relations, such as kind of, feminist international relations. That might be like a little bit, or a security K, that might be like a little too much in PF, at least outside like even a small component of the national circuit, so I don't want to jump on that too much. But look, if I were con, that's what I'd be saying, those three things. If I were pro, I'd really be saying, hey, look, we have to deter, and the only way deterrence works, okay, is through an offensive approach, that a defensive approach isn't going to cut it. I would put that in my first contention. I wouldn't wait for the other team to say that, okay, and then like try to come back up like with some like response against it. Like I wouldn't just say, hey, we need offensive cyber warfare, wait for the rebuttalist to say we need defensive cyber warfare is enough, and then respond to that. I'd have my whole contention be about like why we need offensive cyber warfare and defensive cyber warfare isn't enough. Built all right into that, okay? And then I would say that, like, here's a specific scenario, okay, as to, like, why and where it is needed. Like Iran, like North Korea, whatever, prolif, terrorism, whatever it is that you want to talk about. Okay? I know this is a lot. Good luck with the topic. At least it's for 2 months.